So hopefully you've read the Euthyphro, and if you haven't, I would say go back and read it prior to watching this, or this is probably not going to make much sense to you. So the Euthyphro is this dialogue where Plato has Socrates discussing with Euthyphro questions of piety, which piety, he believes, is justice in relation to the gods. How do you relate properly to the divine, right? We see that in some of his other dialogues, including the Gorgias, where, if you remember the section that I talked about, where Socrates is discussing with Callicles, and he says, "Look, if you're a tyrant and you sort of abuse everyone to your own ends, it's not actually giving you what you want. It's not giving you your own good." Because what it is to be human is to be in community and fellowship with other humans, to have friendship. And that friendship with humans has to do with justice, and friendship with the gods has to do with piety, and that this is the goal of human existence. This is sort of the essence of a flourishing human existence. If you want to be virtuous and you want to help others be virtuous, because in being excellent in what you do and who you are, the word virtue has to do with a sort of excellence of moral excellence, like so courage and generosity and kindness and truthfulness and goodness. These ideas, these sort of attributes that you want the people around you to be that way, and you want to be that way, capable of interacting, of being fair and honest and open and and properly communing with other people. And for Socrates, to commune with the divine is to exercise proper piety. But he wants to know, just like he's always wanting to know, how do you define justice? Right? At the heart of everything, Socrates says in Plato's dialogues, there is this sense that you should do no harm, and that you should examine your own life, and that human wisdom is seriously lacking. We often claim to know things that we don't know. Those are sort of three of the main core underlying grounding ideas for Socrates. So when he seeks out what is justice, what is piety, it's in relation to those. He believes that justice is a real thing. He believes that piety is the reality of justice in relation to the divine realities. And so when he meets the Euthyphro himself is a younger man than Socrates, and he styles himself, he kind of considers himself this sort of prophet, and he's convinced that he has visions. And you should see that in the dialogue itself, where Euthyphro talks about his own sort of spiritual insights. Him being a sort of visionary religious expert is how he sees himself. And he takes very seriously all the myths, all of the Homeric myths of the gods and the demigods. And so that's the virtue of Euthyphro. Or that's not the virtue, sorry, that's the religion of Euthyphro, right? And it's when we talk about religion, I would argue it's a religion that's not concerned with virtue. And I'll get into what I'm talking about, because I think this is at the heart of what Socrates is trying to get at. So the backdrop and the context, right? Socrates, they're outside of the court, right? They're outside of the place where court is held, where the citizens come together to make decisions, to vote. When somebody's brought to an accused of a crime before the city council, in essence. So they're outside of that. Euthyphro is on his way out. He is prosecuting his father. Socrates is on his way in to kind of give sort of a pre-trial defense, to find out sort of everything about the accusations against him. And he's being accused of impiety and for corrupting the youth, and on some level for atheism. And we will eventually read the apology. The apology is where it's the record of sort of Socrates' defense of himself against those charges. And he says in that, look, I can't be an atheist because I've told you that the reason I'm doing what I'm doing is because there's a messenger from the gods, right? And so there can't be a messenger from the God if there's no God. So that's he's saying I don't disbelieve in God. He says, but there's another accusation of impiety which may involve creating gods other than the gods of the city, and this is a big deal. So he wants to get from Euthyphro what is piety, because he has some ideas, but if you remember from early on, Socrates takes seriously the difference between knowledge and opinion. And you can have a more or less educated opinion, right? You have to start with opinion. You have to start with some ideas and you work from there and question them. And you want the most educated opinion that you can have until you can get knowledge. Knowledge is definitely true. So he's always searching for true knowledge, for what is genuinely knowledge, but he always works with the most educated opinion he can get. And so, this timing is before his case, and this is his reason, right? He's got to defend himself. He knows how he's going to defend himself against the accusation of being an atheist. Like, I have a messenger from the God. I believe in the God. I believe I'm doing service to the God. You can't call me an atheist. Am I being impious? Am I being impious? Am I rejecting the gods of the city out of pride or arrogance? Or should I believe, what is piety? That's the question he has. And when we get to the apology later, you'll find out that he never fully answers that. He does answer the challenge, the charge of not believing in God, and he does answer the charge of corrupting the youth. He says, look, here are all these people here in my defense who are the parents of sons who spend their time with me. If I'm corrupting the youth, those would be the men most ready to accuse me, but they're here to defend me. Furthermore, why would I ever want to corrupt the youth? If I am doing something to corrupt the youth, who wants to live in a society of corrupt people? So I don't, so why would I corrupt them purposely? If I'm corrupting them, it must be an accident. So really, you shouldn't be looking to punish me. You should be looking to correct me, right? So those are sort of the essence of his defense. And the Euthyphro, on some level, as far as the context of Plato's writings, right? Euthyphro gives you some backdrop and context as to why Socrates, in his defense, doesn't really address the piety question that much, because he can't get a real answer. In some sense, the implication for Plato, which is the implication, I think, for Socrates, and we'll talk about this later, is that piety is deeply connected to justice. And so if we want to know how to be pious, we must know how to be just. But this is the context, historically, of what's going on in this dialogue, which is very important. What we're going to see by the end of, I'm going to introduce at the end of this lecture, the Euthyphro dilemma in relation to some sort of modern post-Enlightenment questions about religion and ethics. Now, I'm not going to claim that those questions aren't there at all in the Euthyphro, but the way the Euthyphro has been treated in a modern context, I think often fails to even look seriously at the original context of what's going on, which I think relates very closely to certain issues in a variety of religions, and it has to do with this issue of virtue and how virtue humans relate to God in relation to virtue, in relation to excellence and being good. So virtue ethics in a religious context versus some other sort of ethical approach. So this religious context, right, I just mentioned, the big question is purity. So Euthyphro is rather proud of what he's doing. Why is he at this court? Well, he's going to accuse his father. Now, this within the culture is incredibly crazy. You don't do that. Now, for Socrates, he takes it very seriously, but you have to remember that from the Gorgias, in Plato's context, Socrates, the hero for Plato, right? Socrates has said in the context of the Gorgias, hey, it's better to suffer injustice than to commit it. And in fact, if your family member commits true injustice, then you should desire them to meet with correction, even if the correction takes on with it some form of punishment. Better to be corrected than to harm your own soul by committing injustice. And so it's not that Socrates is totally opposed to Euthyphro. Um, this gains his curiosity and his attention because Euthyphro, if you're going to do that, you must really, really know what justice is. And for Euthyphro, this idea of justice is tied up very deeply in this question of purity. Now, I have some stuff for you to watch on purity. We'll talk a little bit about it here. And after this, you should watch and answer the questions on purity from different perspectives and religions. But we tend to be sort of critical in the modern context when we look at religions that have purity rituals and purity issues. We often think, oh, that's so backwards, that's so superstitious, that's sort of silliness. Those people have all those taboos. They don't want to be impure before the divine. But it's because we don't, I would argue, we don't understand really what's going on with purity in that context. And we don't understand purity in relation to connection and community, community with other humans and community with the gods. Now, if you think, well, purity, according to moral purity, that's an antiquated, silly idea. It may be that you don't really believe in a god, right? And like I said, we'll get into this more in the next slide or two. But the problem in this context, and we see this in most ancient systems, and I would say it echoes in our own, but in most ancient systems, religious and otherwise, but especially religious systems, there's this idea of everyone being in connection and community. Remember the Gorgias, where Socrates says, you've lost the point of really being human when you become the tyrant because you've lost friendship with humans and with divine beings. You're no longer in friendship with them. And so that's the essence of humanity, is to be in this community. And in some sense, the people of a land are connected not only to each other and not only to the divine beings, but also to the land. The land itself has connection to the people. If you know anything about Arthurian legend, right, the king and the land are one. In other contexts, that there's this idea well, the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, right? You see this idea of the land becoming impure because innocent blood is shed on it. The land cries out, wanting for things to be right. The land itself sort of grieves over the evil done to it. And if you think, oh, that's silly, that's ridiculous, we don't feel that way. Well, actually, we kind of do. I mean, if you look at anybody who cares at all about environmental policies, right? What are they saying? That our corruption, our greed, our selfishness, something about the way we're living our life is injuring, in essence, the earth, the planet, the waters, the land, animals, something. We see ourselves as interconnected with the things around us, not only other humans, but with the land, with the environment. We talk about it in slightly different languages, in slightly different language, right? But we have a similar idea that you can defile, you can destroy, you can create disunity and disruption through corruption, right? Through evil, you can corrupt things, everything, including the land. So in ancient cultures, in the Hebrew text, right? If someone, well, you have, there's this famous story of Cain and Abel, the first two brothers. Adam and Eve have two sons, Cain and Abel. And, it's a sort of look at the the human tendency to become corrupt and defensive and angry and let that anger fester and destroy others, right? So, or jealousy, right? So Cain offers God a sacrifice in the wrong way. Abel offers God a sacrifice in the right way. God accepts Cain's sacrifice. I'm sorry, God accepts Abel's sacrifice and rejects Cain's. Cain gets angry at his brother. God says, "Why are you angry? If you do the right thing, if you offer the right offerings, you'll be recognized for doing that as well. Go back and do it right." And instead, Cain, in his jealousy, kills Abel and hides his body. And when God comes back, he says, "Your brother's blood cries out from the ground." Right? This theme is carried throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, like the blood crying out from the ground, the earth crying out because of the brokenness. Even in the New Testament, you have this passage where one of the key apostles, the Apostle Paul, writing in one of his many letters, says, "The earth longs for the revelation of the sons of God." Who are the sons of God? Those are the people who are sort of connected to this Messiah, Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And in their connection to him, they start to become like him. They become sons of God also. And the implication is they'll be wise, they'll be just, they'll be true, they'll be pure. And when they come into contact with the earth, they'll do what's good for the earth. The earth won't have to grieve. So the earth longs for the revelation of the truly good and pure and righteous and just individuals who are in God, who are in Christ, right? So this is not this is common to religions and legends and philosophies throughout human history, that you can do things that bring impurity, and through impurity you bring sort of disconnection. So again, in the Hebrew Scriptures, there's this idea even of if someone is murdered and they know who commits the murder, then there's things that have to be done to the murderer has to be put to death. Things have to be done to sort of purify the land. If they don't know who committed this, so if they just find a murdered body out in the wilderness, then it's not in a city, right? Then well, first of all, if they find a murdered body in a town and they cannot figure out who committed the murder, the town itself has to make offering to God to purify the land, right? And so it's to the degree that if they find a murdered body that's not in a town, then they have to measure the distance to all the nearest towns, and whichever town is closest has to make restitution. They have to purify the land. They have to give an offering to sort of cleanse the land of the shedding of the human blood, of killing of the presumed innocent person who's dead, right? So because the impurity leads to distance, right? I mean, this may sound silly, but think about, if someone is just covered in filth, it's hard to have close relations to them without them being cleaned up on some level, right? It's hard to. That's just on a basic level. So this is more on a sort of cosmic, ontological level. But there are other aspects of purity, but it affects connection and community. So when Euthyphro is concerned about is that his father has two servants, and one of the servants murdered another servant. So then the father doesn't know what to do, so he ties up the murderer and leaves him in a pit. Basically, they don't have prison standards like we have now. It's basically a makeshift prison. He can't get away. And he sends for a messenger to the oracle at Delphi. This is the way to hear from the god. I have a situation I don't know what to do about. I need a word from the god on how to deal with this. Why does he need a word from the god on how to deal with this? Well, there are customs, there are laws, there are rules, there's understandings. If your servant kills my servant in this time and place, then your household is obligated to make restitution for the action of your servant because your servant is part of your household. There isn't some like, you know, court of law where we find this person guilty of prison or of murder and we put them in prison or we kill them. It's up to actually households to enact justice, right? Somebody in your household kills or injures someone in my household, we have to come to an agreement before the community, and the community including the divine, the gods. And by that agreement on restitution, we reestablish order, because impurity is also about disorder, and disorder is destructive. So we're going to bring about purity through connection in the community. And the one household is obligated to make restitution to the other household. Why does Euthyphro's father have a problem? Both servants are in his own household. So, wow, that's a problem, because sometimes the restitution is if somebody commits murder, somebody, your servant murders my servant, then your servant is put to death, or you make some other restitution for my servant, or some combination of those two, right? Well, Euthyphro's family, his father, is out one servant already because of murder. If he just puts the other servant to death, he's losing out doubly, right? He's not. There's no restitution made. Okay, the guilty party's put to death, but that seems counterproductive. Part of the reestablishing purity is to reestablish order and to make restitution. Since the offender and the offended are in the same household, how do you make restitution? That's why he needs to send to the God, because it's not a common occurrence. It doesn't have an easy fix. There's no other household involved. So he's trying to fix it according to what the gods would want. This is a puzzling instance for him, right? It doesn't have an easy fix. While this murdering servant is tied up and basically imprisoned in a pit, he dies. Now, the vast majority of people would see that as, well, you've done everything you could. You've restrained the offender, you've restrained the murderer, and you've gone to the gods to find out what you need to do with him. And in the meantime, he has died. The vast majority of the culture, it's not just that they don't care, they see that as justice has been done, in essence, by the universe. The gods have acted. The man is dead. That was his fate. He committed murder. He's a murderer. He had to die. Euthyphro, because you tried to, Euthyphro's dad, whatever his name is, right? You tried to honor the gods by finding out what to do. The burden was removed from you. You did everything you could. This is how people see this problem. Well, Euthyphro doesn't see it that way. He thinks now his dad is guilty of murder. Some scholars have conjectured that maybe, the murdering servant is Euthyphro's favorite, and the one who's murdered is somebody that Euthyphro doesn't care about. It's possible. The dialogue doesn't tell us that. What we can see from the historical context, right, there's nothing outside the dialogue to tell us that, but what we can see from the historical context is the vast majority of people aren't just siding with the father because he's older, and they're not thinking Euthyphro's crazy, and Socrates is not shocked because, Socrates, while he said in the Gorgias, if your family member commits injustice, you should seek to bring about their discipline, their punishment for the saving of their soul, in essence. Socrates is not backtracking on that. Think about the things he talks about. Euthyphro isn't the problem if someone commits murder, or it's not that someone else says, well, it doesn't matter that they murdered, right? They shouldn't be killed. That's not the point. What the point is, well, no, that's not murder, right? So the disagreement comes in on how do you define what is the crime? Is this a crime? Not should a crime be punished? Should a crime be disciplined? Should there be restitution? The question is it actually a crime when there's a debate about these types of moral issues? And so what Socrates is trying to draw Euthyphro's attention to is, Euthyphro, people aren't telling you not to prosecute your father because he's your father, though some might say that. What they're saying is, prosecuting your father is a sort of odd thing to do. It's disrespectful to your father, perhaps. But it's more disrespectful because to the vast majority of us, Socrates is sort of including himself, it doesn't look like your father's done much wrong here. He was trying to deal with someone who had committed murder. None of the rest of us think he's murdered anybody. Your father, right? So this is the issue. This is the matter of purity, but Euthyphro takes it very seriously, this issue of purity. He doesn't want to be connected to the impure, because if he's impure, then he's out of touch with the gods. And how does he live his life? How does he make his living? What does his prestige come from? He claims to be a sort of oracle, which may be another point of offense, right? Dad sent to the oracle at Delphi. Doesn't he know that I talk to the gods and I hear from the gods? I mean, there's all kinds of things possible going on here within that family. But what we have from the historical context without conjecture, what we have from the text without conjecture, is the vast majority of people agree that impurity is a problem. But the vast majority of people, unlike Euthyphro, think the impure person was the servant who murdered the other servant, not the father. And so that's a big part of what Socrates is trying to draw Euthyphro's attention to at the beginning. But, you know, we don't get it, like I mentioned, because we think of purity rules and issues of taboos, which are rules that we don't always know the reason for them, or rules that persist maybe even when the reason no longer exists, because that's the way we've always done it, right? So we look at these as sort of backwards. And so we say, you know, well, and here again, I'm not for, women being forced to wear a hijab. That's not what I'm saying here. So don't read into this comparison anything of this sort, right? I am not making a value judgment for you to consider here. I am not in favor of forcing women to cover their faces and everything else and not be able to drive or whatever. I think there's some real problems with any kind of system that does that. But that said, we look at a woman, Muslim woman in a full hijab, covering her face. What's the point of that? The point of that is that her beauty, the beauty of women, is greatly respected almost to the point of fear within certain expressions of Muslim Islamic culture. Right. So, the woman's beauty can drive men to madness, and so to avoid sort of creating a stumbling block of making a man commit some crime, or some to avoid creating jealousy or leading to some sort of harassment or rape, the woman's beauty should be covered and protected, right? Anyone who's any Muslim I've ever met, male or female, who's in favor of any kind of headscarf, head covering, face covering, will say it's because we value the beauty that's hidden. We don't want you don't put your greatest treasures out there for everybody to see. If you've got some kind of family, heirloom jewelry, you don't just set it out on the front porch, right? That anybody could walk by while you're not home and just take it. You don't just. So there's this sense of, well, you protect what's beautiful and what's, we want to remain a pure culture. We want to remain an ordered culture. We don't want men to lust after our women. So that's why, and we think, well, that's silly. You shouldn't cover their faces. I would argue that there could be various reasons that we think it's silly. One would be that you might think it's the man's responsibility to control his lust, his drives, his way of thinking and looking at women. That would be mine. Another one is that you don't believe in that sexual lust is an impurity, right? That you don't think there's no big deal. As long as a man doesn't do something to a woman, he can think whatever he wants. He can look at whatever is out there. He can think about it, meditate on it, fantasize about it. There's no big deal, because maybe we don't believe in the idea of sort of sexual purity. But we do believe in purity, and we're willing to make a lot of people cover their faces for the sake of purity, right? We did that for a few years there. Is this the same thing? Not exactly. Is there similarity? Yeah, what you believe is real affects what you believe is good and permissible. You don't believe that sexual impurity and lust, or that lust is a sexual impurity. You don't believe that a man seeing a beautiful woman's face creates lust, and if it does, it's the man's fault, not hers. And you shouldn't have to act as a woman to protect a man from his own impurity. It's not your job. But really, it's quite possible that you just don't believe in that type of impurity, or you don't think that impurity is serious, or you think the other person is responsible for that issue of purity, not you. But then we've turned around because we believe in germs. We believe in germs very adamantly, more than we believe in sexual impurity. We believe in germs, and so we think it's our responsibility to protect other people from our germs, and we cover our faces, right? Um, it's a very similar thing. The question is, right, what is good depends on what is real. If there's no danger of hell because of lust and sexual impurity of thought, then who cares who covers what? Who cares who wears what? Who cares what a man thinks about and fantasizes about when he sees a beautiful woman? Who cares? Doesn't matter. That impurity thing's not a real issue. But now a disease, that's a real thing. We believe in that. So, right? This is my point. It's the only point I want to make looking at that. Don't be too swift to criticize a culture for trying to protect itself from impurities that they believe cause chaos and disorder. This is the point. The understanding is that goodness, wholeness, purity, justice, these things are connected and related to each other. They're rooted in the nature of the world. You want order and not chaos. It means you want purity and not impurity. It means you want justice and not injustice. And these things are related to what it is to be pious. We might debate over what is pure, what is impure, what is just, what is unjust, but we all want the justice, we all want the purity based on what we believe to be real, right? That's a human reality. You don't go to a restaurant with a grade of C over the door, typically, right? If you were walking in a restaurant and you said the health department gives this restaurant a grade of C, I don't know if they're allowed to open if they have a grade of C or if that is a thing, but if you saw that sign, you'd probably go the other way and find a different restaurant, right? Because you do believe in purity on some level. You believe in germs, you believe in food poisoning, you believe in physical cleanliness, right? Purity makes a difference. In fact, I have, like I said, I have some brief videos for you to watch in relation to purity in different religious contexts. And as you do that, I want you to think about the fact that every culture has its purity standards. Those purity standards are based on what you think is real, because what you think is real determines what you think is good and relates to purity. So that's what's going on in the Euthyphro, right? That is what's going on. The question of taboos, right? Socrates might be thinking of Euthyphro like you're going too far with this, right? You don't really understand what purity is. You don't get it. This is and so a taboo is simply a purity rule that's maintained, but nobody knows what the purity rule is, right? Or they've forgotten the reason, or the reason it really is no longer there, right? You should always do this way, but not really. It was temporal, but something that was temporally practical and necessary became permanently determined. So, when you see the people riding around alone in their car with a mask on, right? That's up to them. It's not a criticism. Point being, is there a sort of nature of taboo there? You got into the habit of doing this. This is a rule for maintaining purity. You get so much into the habit of doing it that you just continue to do it. Maybe without thinking about it, maybe just because it's more comfortable. It's what I've done for so long now. Right? That's a taboo. Every culture has its purity laws. Every culture has its taboos. So I want you to read the Euthyphro and think about the Euthyphro in that context, right? Now, moving further into the Euthyphro, just beyond the context of the actual when the conversation is happening, the sort of sociological context, the religious context of purity, I want you to think through what's central to this dialogue. Right? And I think what Socrates is trying to do is challenge Euthyphro that he has a religious view which he thinks is about righteousness and purity, but is actually divorced from any real sense of virtue. And Socrates wants Euthyphro to see that. And when we read in the Euthyphro, what we get is this sense of purity, the sense of rightness of the gods, where Socrates is questioning. He's questioning Euthyphro, and he's like, Euthyphro, do you really believe that the gods are like the stories that Homer wrote? Right? Do you really think that? Um, I'm trying to find a quick quote here, or a couple of them, I should say. Um, he says, um, it's 6a in the if you have a translation that has the sort of marginal. Um, Euthyphro appeals to the story of Zeus killing his own father, or no, sorry, binding his own father. His father, the father of Zeus, um, Kronos had swallowed his own children, and so Zeus, in essence, imprisons him and releases his siblings. And that's how Zeus becomes the chief god. And Euthyphro believes this. And then Socrates says, I wonder if this is why I am being prosecuted, Euthyphro. Because when someone says such things about the gods, so Euthyphro has just accounted the story of how he believes that the gods would be on his side in prosecuting his father, because after all, Zeus had prosecuted and imprisoned his own father for swallowing his children. Um, but Socrates is saying, I think this must be why I'm being called to trial, because whenever anyone says such things about the gods, I somehow find it difficult to accept. Perhaps this is why people claim I transgress. But as it is, if even you who know such things so well accept them, people like me must apparently concede. What indeed are we to say, who ourselves agree that we know nothing of them? But in the name of Zeus, the god of friendship, tell me, do you truly believe that these things happened so? Yes, and things still more wonderful. That's Euthyphro, right? So Socrates is questioning the mythologies that have the gods doing things like warring with each other. Um, in fact, sorry, let me find one other quote um, that kind of clarifies this. Um, um, he Socrates. I'm sorry, I've lost the other quote. Um, Socrates believes the gods are good, that they're divine means good, it means just, that there's no warring within the gods. And sorry, I just refound the other the other quote, but the other quote has to do with my apologies, I'm losing my voice here. This other quotation has to do with Socrates' view, his questioning of when he says to Euthyphro, so what is piety, right? What does piety look like? And Euthyphro says it's kind of like, you give the gods offerings and prayers and they give you what you want. And so Socrates says, so the art of holiness would be a kind of business transaction between the gods and men. And Euthyphro says, yes, if it pleases you to call it that. But Socrates says, nothing pleases me unless it happens to be true. But tell me, what benefit do the gods gain from the gifts they receive from us? It is clear that everyone that they give, for we have nothing good they have not given. Socrates has this idea that everything good comes from the source of all things, which is divine, and the divine is good and just and holy and true and good. And so you can't have warring gods, you can't have raping gods, you can't have demigods that come from incestuous or adulterous or rape, any kind of sexual relations like that. The gods are something other and above. And he says, maybe that's why I'm being prosecuted. I don't believe in those types of gods. I believe that the divine is just and good and holy and true. It's interesting in the Euthyphro, there are points at which Socrates, and in fact, there are some early Christian philosophers, Justin Martyr, Athenagoras, who thought that Socrates, or that Plato, and therefore Socrates, had understanding of the God of Israel. Some of them thought that Plato had actually read the Old Testament because of things like this, where he says, what are you going to give the gods? Everything good comes from the God. The God is the source of all good things that humans have. That echoes with many things out of the Psalms and the prophets in the Hebrew Scriptures in the Old Testament, where they say things like, God says things like, how are you going to give me an offering? I own everything. I'm the source of everything. I own the cattle on 1,000 hills. Do you really think I want an offering? What I want is for you to act justly towards your neighbor, to not mistreat the poor, to not abuse people. So there are some early Christian philosophers that actually think Plato is echoing the Hebrew Scriptures. It's unlikely that he actually had access to that. The Hebrew Scriptures, I don't think the timing overlaps. I don't think they had actually been translated into Greek yet. I think that was about 100 or so years later. But I could be wrong on that. But that said, it's highly unlikely. I don't know of any modern scholars that think that Socrates or Plato actually had access to the Hebrew Scriptures. But the point being, there's some echoes in Socrates again that relate to this sort of virtue religious tradition that says God is good, God is holy, God is just, God is the source of all good things. You can't bargain with God, in essence. You can't just pay him an offering and he'll pay you back. So Socrates is calling that sort of religion into question, and Euthyphro follows that sort of religion. And it's interesting because Socrates is not shy. I mean, he tells Euthyphro, I want you to teach me what piety is, but then he tells Euthyphro what? Well, I can't believe that. Like, maybe you're right. Who of us knows? He questions Euthyphro's knowledge, right? Which again, maybe why Euthyphro gets more and more irritated and tries to get out of the conversation. And may have been why Euthyphro was so irritated as his father, because Euthyphro believes himself to have special religious knowledge based in the mythologies of Homer and things like that. This is the type of arrogance and ignorance that Socrates is constantly confronting in Athens. And with the Euthyphro, he's confronting that in relation to religion and the divine. But Socrates is not saying there's no divine. He's not saying that justice doesn't matter. He's not saying that the gods don't care about justice. He's not saying that the gods don't command just things. He's not saying that the gods don't value the institution and the correction of institution of justice and the correction of injustice. He's arguing that humans lack the full knowledge of the justice that the gods know, and that really, in some sense, piety is related to justice. So early Christians would have seen in Plato's writings passages like you see in Psalm 50 or Psalm 40, verses 6 through 8, or the book of Isaiah, or the book of Jeremiah, or the Hosea, or Hebrews, where it goes again and again and talks about how God is the source of all good things. There's no offering that you can give him. He's a just God. He doesn't show favoritism. He's not unjust. He's not perverse. He can't be bribed. These types of ideas that are key to the Judeo-Christian understanding, Plato, through the voice of Socrates, resonates with that idea. If it's divine, it's good, it's just, it's holy, it's true, it's righteous, it's not corrupt, it's not warring with itself, it's not bickering. The divine is the source of wisdom and knows what is really good, versus the human, which lives in ignorance, right? So the other thing that the Euthyphro is about is looking for universals, right? Universals are the idea that essentially a definition that covers many instances. So if you go to, again, if you have a translation that has the marginal numbers, that early on in the conversation, Euthyphro says, well, the pious thing is to do what I'm doing, right? Um, but then Socrates says, but Euthyphro, there are other things that are holy too, correct? He says, well, yes, of course there are. He says, so do you recall that I did not ask you to teach me about some one or two of the many things which are holy, but about that characteristic itself by which all holy things are holy? For you agreed, I think, that it is by one character that unholy things are unholy and holy things holy, or do you not recall? I do. Then teach me what this very character is, so that I may look to it and use it as a standard by which should those things which you or someone else may do be of that sort, right? I want to know what is the essence of holiness, just like I want to know what is the essence of justice. On the point of justice, he has the beginnings. He knows you should do no harm. He knows it is better to suffer an injustice than to commit one, because you should not harm someone. Harm is to do someone an unjust act. And so that's the sort of the beginnings of the essence, but he doesn't fully understand the essence of justice, and therefore he doesn't fully understand the essence of piety, and he wants Euthyphro to try to give him that. But what we're seeing is that Euthyphro cannot give him that, because Euthyphro sees the gods as warring with each other, as bickering with each other, as capricious, everything that the mythologies say they are. And Socrates says, I just can't buy that. And he says, don't you understand, Euthyphro, that when you have that, what people disagree on, um, people don't disagree. He says, if we want to know what's heavier, what's lighter, what's further, what's nearer, we can measure. But what sort of things make us enemies, angry at each other, if we disagree about it and are unable to arrive at a decision? Perhaps you cannot say offhand, but I suggest you consider whether it would not be about the just and the unjust, beautiful and ugly, good and evil. Are not these the things, when we disagree about them and cannot reach a satisfactory decision concerning which we on occasion become enemies, you and I, and all other men? What about the gods? If they were to disagree, would they not disagree for the same reasons? Then by your account, my noble friend, different gods must believe that different things are just and beautiful and ugly, good and evil. For surely they would not quarrel unless they disagree on this. So what he's saying is, Socrates is saying, I can't logically believe in bickering, fighting gods, because the gods have knowledge of the just, of the true, of the beautiful, of the good. And because they have knowledge, just like we could find knowledge of how far away it is from Columbia to Charleston, we could look it up, we could measure it, or how much, a certain book weighs. We can weigh it, we can find scales that match, and we can weigh it and determine. But when it comes to things like this, we humans have flawed and limited knowledge. The gods have true knowledge. This is part of Socrates' ideals, right? So this is part of why Socrates can't believe in the gods the way Euthyphro does, or the gods of the city, which are warring with one another and disagreeing with each other. So this brings us to the question of, well, Euthyphro wants to say, well, what's holy is the thing that all the gods love. And it brings us to that kind of confusing conversation. Okay, Euthyphro, is it loved because it is holy, or is it as holy because they love it? And that's that whole thing. Is it carried because it's being carried? Is it, because someone is carrying it, or is someone carrying it because it's being carried, right? Well, it's called carried because someone is carrying it. The act of carrying it makes it carried. Is it loved because it is just, or is it just because it is loved, right? This is the question. And we're going to look, that's going to be the essence of this question of the Euthyphro dilemma, which I'm also in, there's in your added stuff, you don't necessarily have to, there's no questions to go with this, but if you look in the supplemental materials, there's a long discussion about the Euthyphro dilemma, and I'll have another lecture about that following shortly. But the dilemma is what most people in modern studies of Plato's dialogues of the Euthyphro jump to, right? Is because this dilemma addresses the question of divine command ethics. And divine command says that something is good because God is powerful, God wants it, and therefore that's what makes it good. God is powerful, power is what makes something good or bad. Um, Socrates doesn't go that route. Euthyphro kind of does. The gods are the gods, therefore whatever they say goes. Um, and if they're going to disagree, you should probably pick the most powerful god, in essence. Um, Socrates is saying, no, the gods don't disagree because the gods know. They know what is true, they know what is good, they know what is just, they know what is pious, and therefore they act in line with that because that's the only thing that makes sense. If you know the good, why would you do anything else? If you know the just, why would you do anything else? And so because the gods have knowledge, that's what divine means, and the gods have power, that's what divine means, and the gods are not going to disagree and fight. They're going to love something that's just and good and holy. Whereas Euthyphro is going to say, well, no, it's the fact that the gods love it is what makes it just and good and holy. And that's sort of, in essence, there's a certain type of religious ethic that's not concerned so much with virtue or so much with ontology being the way sort of the divine constructed the universe. It's not that there is justice in the universe in some sense put there. It's not that there are just standards that are independent of any given person's actions or desires. It's that God is the most powerful, so therefore whatever God says, that is just at the moment. And if he changes his mind, then what's just changes. That's going to be at the essence of the Euthyphro dilemma. And we'll deal with that more in the next lecture.